got another set of affordable cine lenses to look at today. We're going to be looking at the LAOWA Argus lenses. They're all T1. And they're going to be released in 3 different versions. So you've got micro four thirds, super 35 and full frame. All of them T1, but each of them having slightly different focal lengths. So the full frame is available in 28, 35 and 45 millimeters. The Super 35 is available in 18, 25 and 33, whereas the Micro Four Thirds is only available in 2 focal lengths, the 18 and the 25 millimeter. All of them T1. So you know the deal by now. We're going to look at a bunch of sample footage. I'm going to show you it in Rec 709 and also some graded. We're also going to put these lenses up against some other lenses that I have. So this is going to include the DZOFILM Vespids, the Night Walkers, and my 18-35 Sigma art lens. So this video is not going to be an in-depth review. It's going to be more of a first look and more of an overview of these lenses. I've only had them for 2 weeks and I only had 2 focal lengths. So I've been testing the 18mm and the 33mm. So these are both Super 35, so I didn't have the full frame set in. So these lenses are all going to be available in Micro Four Thirds and all the mirrorless mounts under the sun except the L mount. So because of that, I got the lenses in RF mount and I've been shooting with them on my Komodo. So these lenses are interesting. They're all T1, very fast. And a thing I noticed immediately when I first went out to shoot with them is that they didn't immediately fall apart when I shot with them wide open. So normally with these more affordable cine lenses, as soon as you get below, T2, you really start to see some grunge and funk coming through, because that's sort of a hallmark of these cheaper lenses. It's much more costly to make very clean optics wide open. But at T1, the image quality was very good. I think they're going to be mostly compared to recent releases from the likes of DZO with the Arlos, which we featured a few weeks ago, and the Athenas, which I'm hoping to get in July. As you'd expect, focus and aperture wheels are consistent across the sets. I have asked LAOWA whether they plan to release more focal lengths. I haven't got an answer on that yet. I would imagine that they will later on. But at the moment, we are sitting very firmly within that sort of middle ground of focal lengths. So, that is probably the range in which most people are going to be working, so it makes sense. But it would also be nice to see some wider and tighter focal lengths come out in the future. Even when shooting wide open at T1, the performance of these lenses was really impressive. They're not tack razor sharp like the DZOFILM Arlos are or the Nisi Athenas, but they have this beautiful, wonderful fall off, which I personally was really attracted to. So I have had my eye drawn to shooting on more modern glass, mainly because all of the sort of vintage character-esque lenses that are on offer that have fast apertures don't tend to perform very well wide open. Like even my DZOFILM Vespids, they have great center sharpness wide open, but they show a lot of CA and there's a lot of fall off towards the edges. There is a slight loss of contrast when you are shooting, below T2. It wasn't, enough to sort of ruin the shot or make them unusable. They were very usable wide open. These lenses have a bit more texture in them. They're not as tack sharp as the other releases from like Nisi and DZOFILM, but that's not to their detriment. These definitely fall more on the sort of character, interesting. They're not vintage, I would say, but they have a bit more personality to them. A nice alternative offering to some of those other ultra sharp modern lenses that have been released recently. So we're going to look at these lenses in a slightly more controlled environment and do a few side-by-sides of other lenses I have. But first, let's just cycle through the T-stops of these lenses. You can see there's a bit of vignetting, quite heavy fall off, wide open. If we cycle through this really quickly, you can see it more pronounced, but it sort of disappears around the T2.8 to T4 range. And we see the same again with the 33. So there's a bit of vignetting and fall off, wide open, and then it falls off around T2.8 to T4. I'd say the lenses render a little bit on the warmer side. So here's our first comparison. The Sigma art on the skin tones is a little bit more sort of magenta and red. It's quite subtle, a little bit more detail maybe in the hair and the face. Here we have the LAOWA Ranger Super 35 version, the zoom lens. This is the 18 to 50, I think it is. You can see here that the Argus just appears a lot sharper off the bat. You can see a bit of fuzziness and chromatic aberration in the plant in the background for the Ranger. Argus is a little bit warmer, a bit more magenta on the Ranger. At T2.8 you can see, especially in the blue jumper, that the Argus is significantly sharper. So here we have the 35mm SIRUI Night Walker, and you can see on the plant on the background we're getting some sort of green chromatic aberration showing up that isn't showing up on the Argus. Again, the Argus appears a fraction warmer, a bit more detail on the Argus I think. Again, yeah, you can see it night and day on this shot here. When we look at the texture on the jumper, sharpness is much better on the Argus. And even when you stop down to T4, the Night Walker improves a lot, but it just doesn't quite match the sharpness and detail that we're seeing on the Argus lens. Whether you can see this on YouTube, I don't know. Next up, let's look at the DZOFILM Vespid. Again, looking at the green plant in the background, you can just detect a little bit of green chromatic aberration coming through, and then we swap to the Argus. There's a fraction of green chromatic aberration on that plant, but it doesn't seem as pronounced. You can see immediately that the Argus is much warmer than the Vespid. The skin tones look quite different here actually. The skin tone on the Argus is much warmer, whereas it's a bit paler and a bit more magenta-y on the Vespid. But in terms of sharpness, I would say the Argus, especially at T2, is looking a little sharper. Dropping down to T2.8, again still sharper, and if you look at the top of the collar on the DZO Vespid, we're picking up some magenta chromatic aberration. There's a fraction of it on the Argus, but it is barely visible. Stopping down to T4, the chromatic aberration on the Vespid is still very visible on that collar. It sharpens up quite nicely by this point, but it still doesn't quite match the Argus. So in terms of chromatic aberration on the Argus, there is some. This is a very sort of challenging shot that is going to show up most chromatic aberrations. So it's very high contrast, sharp lines, and you can see just around that black pelly case and on the main metal strut, we're getting a lot of magenta fringing. Again, this is T1 wide open, so you'd expect to see some. And then when you stop down, I think we're about T4 now, it's pretty much gone. You can't really see it. Wide open on the 33mm, it doesn't seem as pronounced as the 18, I don't think. We've got the presence of some of that magenta fringing around the main metal struts and on the pelly case. Stopping down to T4, it's pretty much gone by this point. There is a sort of slight hint of it, but yeah, pretty much gone, pretty good. Focus breathing, we're on the 18mm here. They do show some, there is a little bit, but it's pretty well controlled. Nothing I would say is too problematic. Again on the 33, maybe there's a hint more on this. Just looking at that lens and the box in the background, see that sort of moving a bit. Now a quick flare test, we're on the 18mm wide open. You'll see when the flashlight hits the lens directly, there's a huge loss of contrast and a slight sort of green tinted sort of flare. Same story on the 33, maybe not quite as intense as the 18. Extreme loss of contrast, T1, as you'd probably expect with something so fast. But that behaviour improves when you get to T4. There is still some loss of contrast with the flaring, but it's much better controlled. Same on the 33mm, there's still that sort of presence of that green flare. Barrel distortion, 18mm does show some at the edges. If you just look at straight lines, as we look at the metal strut here, it just bows a little bit. I don't mind a bit of barrel distortion personally. 33mm is pretty good, doesn't seem to show too much barrel distortion, I don't think.
I think anyone who's looking for some compact cine lenses, these are kind of interesting. I guess they're around the price of the DZOFILM Vespids. They seem maybe a little bit cleaner than those. They're a similar size to the Vespids, and maybe actually a tad heavier, which kind of makes sense because they're much faster. The reason you go for these over the Vespids is if you want that extra T-stop. I actually think they're a lot cleaner than the Vespids. These are an interesting alternative to the DZOFILM RLES. They're obviously much smaller, much easier to work with. They're comparable to the Nisi Athenas. They're a tiny bit heavier and larger, but they have a quite different look to the Athenas. So they have, you know, like I've been saying, a slightly more vintage, more personality vibe. They're not as sort of razor sharp.
So if that is a look that you are drawn to, then these might be a good fit for you. The lack of focal lengths maybe is a bit of a concern if you're going to be investing in new cine lenses. Hopefully LAOWA will commit to releasing additional focal lengths. I'm sure they will. It would be very odd just to release 3 focal lengths and then leave the line. Most other affordable cine lenses over the last few years, like the Night Walkers, launched with 3 lenses, and later they added 2 more, a wider and a tighter. Maybe it is worth waiting until you've got that definite commitment from LAOWA. There's no L mount, which again is disappointing, so I couldn't test them on any of my Lumix cameras. I really think this is an oversight for a lot of these affordable lens manufacturers, especially when they're releasing them in mirrorless only mounts, because you're locking a whole group of users out, especially if you're not going to release the lenses in, you know, a sort of universal mount like PL or EF. So that's really disappointing. I think what's also really interesting with the recent launch of the GH7 is that these are going to be a great pairing, I think, with that camera. Problem for a lot of people with Micro Four Thirds is the smaller sensor size and, you know, not being able to achieve that sort of depth of field look. These lenses are definitely going to be a great pairing with that system, I think, because they do perform so well at T1. They're going to allow you to get a much sort of larger sensor look out of that camera without having to necessarily sacrifice, you know, image quality and performance. So that's it. There'll be affiliate links in the description down below. Obviously, when you purchase stuff from those, it just helps support this channel and my time. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'm Ed, and until next time, see you later.